All right. Good afternoon, everybody. If you're on the East Coast, that is, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. I saw there's a few of you over in the California area, so thank you for joining us today. A couple things before we really get started. I mentioned a few minutes ago, if you have a question at any point during the webinar, make sure to throw that in the Q&A column on the side there. That will just kind of sort everything for us. So at the end of the webinar, we'll make sure to spend some time answering those questions. So if anything comes up throughout the webinar, make sure you ask that, and we will get to it at the end, okay? So we started out with this video for a couple reasons. I found it probably a couple weeks ago as I was doing some research for this webinar and for a couple other things that I've been doing on Generation Z. And I think it really represents what's happening in our culture pretty well. So as you can see, Generation Z is a lot more tech affluent. They have gone through the Great Recession was one thing that was mentioned. They grew up on social media, those types of things. So what we want to do today is really focus on that next generation. And we'll spend some time talking about who Generation Z is, and then how does the church really adapt to reach this next generation better. So let's dig into who exactly is Generation Z. According to a book that I read called Meet Generation Z, the United States population is made up over a quarter of it by Generation Z. So 25.9% of the total US population is this one generation, this next generation. And in Canada, it's even larger than that. In Canada, it makes up over a third of the entire population of the country, 37%. So these statistics really are to show us that that this is a huge generation. And so as a church, as the church, we need to really be prepared for these young adults, for these teenagers and these kids that are growing up. And we'll get into really what their view of the church is and how we can adapt that too. So just wanted to start with those to give you an idea of how large this generation, this next generation really is, because it is pretty huge. In fact, it is the largest of all generations throughout history of the history of Canada and the history of the United States. So obviously that's not the entire world, but in our histories here in North America, Generation Z is the largest of all of them. By 2020, so in just a couple years, Generation Z will make up 40% of all consumers in the United States. So that is a huge number when you think about how marketing is changing, how branding is changing, and how companies are speaking to this next generation, because they are making up 4/10 of all consumers in the next couple years. Generally speaking, Generation Z is a person who was born between 1995 and 2010. Now, if you read Barna's research, who published their large study, I believe in January, their numbers are a little bit different. So they use the years 1999 to 2015. But outside of Barna, generally speaking, it is looked at as 95 to 2010. And I will tell you, my younger brother was born in 95, and I would say that he is probably more in line with Generation Z than with the millennial generation that I'm a part of. So think about it. And you can throw some things in the chat here. Looks like we're having some audio issues. Can anybody hear me, or is it just Vincent that's having this issue? All right. Well, if you can, throw something in the chat. Just let us know. Think about it. Since 1995, so in the last 23 years, think about how the world has changed. And I'm going to go through some things, but I'd love to see some things that you can think of just since the last couple decades, how much has changed. So some things that I think of technologically, in 95, we didn't have a computer in our house. So since then, obviously, things have changed technologically. Politically, things have changed. Culturally, things have changed. So what are some things that you think of that has changed since 1995? Throw that in the chat. I'd love to see some of the things that you guys come up with. Here is a list of some of the things that were listed in a book that I read. And I thought these were kind of really great, just kind of reminders, really, of really what has changed since Generation Z has been on the planet. So one of them is that email has become the new formal communication, while texts and tweets remain enclaves for the casual. So before Generation Z, email was more casual, but now it has become more formal. If you want to communicate more formally, you're going to send an email as opposed to a tweet or a text message, right? Another thing that James White mentioned in his book is that Generation Z has grown up treating Wi-Fi as an entitlement. It's everywhere, right? You go to a coffee shop, you have Wi-Fi. You go to the airport, sometimes you have to purchase it, but there's Wi-Fi. So everywhere we go, Wi-Fi is there. So Generation Z has grown up really, in their teenage years, having Wi-Fi as an entitlement there. The next thing that White mentioned was that the announcement of someone being the first woman to hold a position has impressed only their parents. The reason for that is because it's not new for Generation Z. So I remember a few years ago, the company General Motors in Detroit hired their first woman CEO, and everyone probably my age and older made a huge deal about that, right? Because it was one of the big three. It was a woman holding the office of CEO. She grew up in the company. She was from my hometown too. So it was a huge deal, right? But for Generation Z, that's kind of the normal because they're used to seeing women in high-ranking positions. Charlton Heston is recognized just as much for waving a rifle over his head at the convention as he is for waving his staff over the Red Sea in the Ten Commandments. I thought that was kind of a funny one, but interesting. Some more things. Cell phones have become so ubiquitous in class that teachers don't know which students are using them to take notes and which ones are planning a party. So I was speaking to one of our partner programs, Kids Corner. The producer of that program used to be an elementary teacher. So a few years ago, he had to make the change from not allowing, trying to incorporate cell phone usage into teaching in the classroom. When I was in high school, cell phones were becoming normal. And so there was a ban on them because teachers really didn't know how to handle that. And so now they are so interwoven into everything that we do that a lot of teachers allow them, but you don't know if you're taking notes as a student or if you're talking to someone or planning a party. Another thing is that the therapeutic use of marijuana has always been legal in a growing number of states in the United States. So that was, even a decade ago, marijuana was a huge topic of political discussion, right? But now, Generation Z, the people who are growing up, they've always had that. They've always had that option in a lot of states. So legal marijuana or medical marijuana has always been legal in a lot of states that these kids are growing up in. Another one that I thought was interesting was that Lion King has always been on Broadway. So I was young when The Lion King came out on probably VHS at the time. But for Generation Z, it's always been on Broadway even. And the last thing that I wanted to mention here is that Google has always existed for Generation Z. So the reason I mention all of this huge list of things, and the reason why I asked you to think about what has changed since 1995, is because we need to realize that Generation Z really is completely different than anything that I grew up in, and I am, smack dab in the middle of the millennial generation. Anyone that is older than me should probably realize even more so that Generation Z is growing up in a completely different world than even I grew up in high school, a decade ago or however long it's been. So with that comes technology. Obviously has changed. A lot of what you guys have mentioned is technology driven, right? You're constantly connected to your job, Evelyn says. Anna says social media, cell phones, internet access. So those are kind of a big part of how Generation Z identifies themselves is through technology. So the world that we live in now is an always on. So who mentioned it? Evelyn mentioned that she's always connected to her job, right? We are always on. Our cell phones are always in use. Internet, you don't have to dial up anymore. You're always connected, right? So so in the book, Always On, the main thesis is that we now live in a world that is always connected. And so for Generation Z, that is even more so because that's how they grew up. They don't know any different than that. So because of that, Generation Z uses more technology. If you look at Barna's research, you'll see that they use way more technology than even millennials. So at a certain age, let's say 16, the technology use now compared to the previous generations is obviously quite different. But even just across the board, not looking age specifically, but across the board, Generation Z uses more technology. And I think, again, because that's what they grew up in. They don't know any different. So for my parents, for middle age and older, you're still having to learn how to use new technology, right? My mom, my parents don't understand the concept of wire cutting, of not having a cable box and cable subscription. So anytime they come to our house and have to use Netflix or Hulu, they're completely lost, right? But Generation Z uses more technology because that's what they know and that's how they've grown up. So they're easily adaptable to changing technology too. In his book, James White talks about how Generation Z takes advantage that there are very few constraints on the technology that they use. What he's getting at here is that parents don't put a whole lot of constraints on technology, and so teenagers are taking advantage of that. They're using more technology. They're using media in different ways than we're used to, and so all of that means that, like Jackie was saying, attention spans have shortened, and so we need to also think about how as a church or as a ministry or whatever we're doing, how does that change because media is being consumed differently. So I mentioned a few minutes ago I was talking to Kids Corner producer. His name is Ron, one of my coworkers here. And he's talking about, we're kind of doing a, basically we're rebranding Kids Corner, this kids program, kids and family program. And so we're trying to figure out as a ministry, how do we reach kids and young families in this changing media, changing technology world? And so that's one of the things that he's trying to figure out and struggling through is with media changing, with technology changing, what does that look like? And how do we reach younger people who are using media in such different ways than we're used to? So another thing that comes out, this is actually from ABC News, but kind of the fact that Generation Z is taking advantage of technology because there are a few constraints is partly because mom and dad care about the content of what Generation Z or teenagers, young adults are absorbing, but not necessarily the time spent on media itself. So, so in the Barna research, you'll see that that the amount of time spent with technology or on media, so on your phone, connected to social media, whatever, is largely increased than anyone else. And that's partly because they use more technology, they use it differently, but it's also because mom and dad care about the types of content that they're absorbing, but not necessarily how much time they are consuming that content. Hope that makes sense. So one thing that I found pretty interesting is how mom and dad, how parents in the United States view who is primarily responsible for limiting the mobile use for their children. So of course the majority say the parents are responsible for that. But really what is interesting to me is these smaller numbers. So 5% say the children themselves are responsible for using phones and limiting how much usage. And another 3% say either the manufacturer or the creator of apps that kids are using. I find that really interesting because we are pushing the responsibility from us as parents to someone else. And some of that is because of how people are consuming content. Some of that is, just changing culture, and again, how media is being consumed, how technology is being used. And another thing is, which Vincent, you're kind of getting at this too, is even for me, I didn't grow up having to know how to limit usage on my phone, right? So having or choosing to limit smartphone use or mobile technology use is something that we're trying to learn how to do and how to convince kids how to do it themselves. So something that that as a ministry we are thinking about as Reframe Ministry or Reframe Media Ministry, one thing that we're thinking about is how does our role as a media ministry, how do we develop healthy technology use? How do we help families develop healthy technology use? So let me throw that question at you too. As a church, what role does your church have, or the church global, what role does the church have in helping develop healthy technology use? So it's a very interesting question, and I definitely don't expect a whole lot of answers right now, but something that we need to think through as a church. What role do we play in that? Because it is a changing climate, it's a changing culture. So how do we help families even develop those healthy practices? And another question is, how can the way we communicate adapt to the changing role of technology? So that's something that we need to think about as communicators, is how do we adapt to this changing role that technology is playing in the life of the family, and as things continue to change, what does that look like for younger generations? How do we communicate differently, or how should we be communicating differently? So that's a little bit about technology. I do want to spend some time talking about some other aspects of what makes up Generation Z. So another large section of what makes up Generation Z and their identity is this idea of achievement. So I want to spend some time talking about achievement, because as the church, as we deal with, like I just asked, how do we communicate using technology differently, we also need to think about our messaging itself, because the identity of Generation Z is very achievement driven. So how we communicate should probably look a little bit differently. So looking at achievement, one of the things that defines Generation Z the most defining event in their lifetime is the Great Recession. So if you look at if we go back to I think the first slide, or one of the first slides, I mentioned that the age range for Generation Z is 95, generally speaking, 1995 to 2010. So a lot of them were alive during 9/11, or during the 9/11 era. But that's not what most defines them, because they were so young. My brother was 6 years old, so he obviously was alive and knew something was happening, but was not old enough to figure out how much of an impact 9/11 had. So for Generation Z, the most defining event in their lifetime is the Great Recession. Most of them were kind of at that age where the Great Recession, 2008 to let's say 2010 or 11, meant that dad maybe didn't have a job, or they could see shops closing. They could see they were having to move because houses were getting foreclosed on. Those types of things. So that is really the defining event that Generation Z grew up experiencing, and the aftermath of. So 9/11 they were alive for, but they didn't really because they were so young, the ones that were even alive at that point, they don't really have anything to compare it to as far as memory goes. Great Recession, they were alive and old enough to realize what was happening, at least to see the results of it. So the Public Religion Research Institute asks this question: are Americans' best days ahead of us or behind us? And I ask it, I believe it's every year, and they ask every generation. So what was interesting is their latest study of Generation Z found that it was completely tied, which has never happened in the history of this survey. It was tied at 49% to 49%, saying that America's best days are either ahead of us or behind us. It's always been ahead of us, but as a result of the Great Recession, and as a result of Generation Z kind of coming to age and realizing the political, cultural, socioeconomic culture that we're in, it is the first time that it's been, very, very split. So I thought that was pretty interesting. What Generation Z has realized is that over the last 2 decades, the realities there have led to a strong sense of independence and this spirit of entrepreneurialism. So what that means for Generation Z is that they are marked by a very strong sense of wanting to make a difference. Not only wanting to make a difference, but actually thinking that they can. So the idea of being a social entrepreneur is one of Generation Z's most popular career choices, which has never been the case for millennials, for anyone older than themselves. So as the church, what that means is that we need to realize that Generation Z has this longing to make a difference, that they are trying to help with the social good, and that they want to both be an entrepreneur but also make a difference, and they believe that they can. So that means that in our churches we need to create those opportunities to allow that to happen, and to assist the culture to allow that to take place. Generation Z and religion is probably the one thing that, as the church, we need to really pay attention to, because it is incredibly different than generations past. So Generation Z is the first truly post-Christian generation. A few weeks ago, I wrote an article about how the United States is now this post-Christian culture, and what that means for the church. But what that leads to is this next generation that is now growing up being a truly post-Christian generation as a whole. So millennials, Gen X before them, baby boomers before them, they've been leaving the church slowly. Church attendance has been dropping for the last few decades, and I know that when I was kind of in high school and after high school, probably even through now, the big topic about teenagers leaving high school is that they also leave the church, right? So what that means is when people leave the church and then they become parents, that generation is not in church at all. They have no exposure to Christianity because their parents left the religion or the Christian faith. So in Canada, what this looks like is a survey called the Nones and Dones. Nones being they have no religious affiliation. Dones being that they have, I believe, left whatever religion they were part of. So in Canada, 17% of Canadian immigrants would say that they have no religious affiliation. For non-immigrants, that number is higher, 25%. 1 in 4 Canadians say they have no religious affiliation. In the United States, the nones, or no religious affiliation, are the largest religious group. And that has just happened in the last couple of years. Pew Research does this study I believe every couple years. And just recently, I believe maybe even their most recent survey, the nuns became the largest religious group in the United States. So that means that parents, grandparents, millennials without kids yet have left the faith. They have no religious affiliation anymore. And because of that, Generation Z is growing up having no religious affiliation, no exposure to any sort of Christianity or faith or belief in God, really. So what we see is that in 1994, 62% of Americans attended church frequently. In 2013, barely half attended seldom or never. So not only are they just not attending church frequently, because that number is even lower, but to be able to say that you attend seldom or never is more than half. So what that looks like is obviously declining church attendance, but the culture of families has changed, where church attendance used to be a priority for churches. That is no longer the case. So when you look at Generation Z, roughly 4% of them have a biblical worldview. That's it. The other 96% basically have no religious exposure to Christianity. So what that means for the church is that we have really much so a blank slate. So for the church, that means that we need to realize not only are people leaving the church, but this younger generation has no exposure. They have no preconceived notions to what church should look like or what should happen in church. So the church really does have a blank slate, as Barna put it. And so that means that we really have a huge opportunity to reach this next generation and to then not only just reach them, but realize how we're going to reach them, and help create a biblical worldview for many of them. So the future of the church, if you look at statistics, if you look at all of the numbers since the 60s or the 90s, whatever you want to look at, will show you that attendance has been declining, right? Which we just talked about. But I think that really with no biblical worldview and realizing that Generation Z is the first post-Christian generation, that opens up the church to a huge future and a huge opportunity. So as we were talking just a couple minutes ago, you can see here, and this is from Gallup, from the Gallup poll, showing if you happen to be a member of a church, synagogue, or mosque. So not even just Christianity, but attendance to any sort of religious affiliation has been declining. So I think we mentioned 1994 as the date for like 62% being involved in the church. You can see here that those numbers have been steadily dropping basically since really like 1980 or in the 80s, or sometimes even before that, depending on what you look at. So we could say that the church is doomed, and we're heading towards the outside of culture and all of that. But I think really that gives us a huge opportunity to rethink what we're doing a little bit. And I'll give you some thoughts that I have there on what that looks like. But I think this gives us a good thing to look at and to think about what we need to do to adapt to reach a generation that has no exposure to Christianity. So in his book, which I've referred to quite a bit, if you're really interested in learning more about Generation Z, I think this is a good book to read. I don't think I agree with everything he says, but James White does have some pretty good points. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend this book. But he says, if we are going to talk to someone and listen to someone and learn from someone about how to build a church, then let's talk, listen, and learn from those who have not been Christians, much less churched. After all, they are the true mission field. So I do agree with the premise here that we need to realize who our audience is, and that we need to listen to what their needs are, and what they're experiencing, what their mindset is, because that allows us to then reach them better. So this chart is from Barna, from their Generation Z research. I think this gives a good idea of what the church needs to do to reach this next generation better. So in the ideal church, Barna gave probably 12, maybe 15 different scenarios, and Generation Z and Millennials, you'll see here, were asked to choose which one is the more ideal situation. So you'll see that Generation Z values community over privacy. They value a sanctuary over auditorium, but they also value casual over dignified. Why I decided to select these 3 of those 12 or 15 or whatever it was scenarios is I think this gives a good view of what Generation Z is looking for, and that is that we are authentic. So we need to find a balance between, let's go back and look at this a little more. We need to find a balance between being casual, but not being too casual, because as you can see here, Gen Z values some of the tradition. So a sanctuary over an auditorium shows that they value kind of a little bit of the history of the church, a little bit of the not formalism, but tradition of the church and the history of it, but they don't want too much of it. That is why you'll see casual over dignified. They want you to be real, but they also want to feel connected. So you'll see that in community, and I think that's why you also see sanctuary. They want to feel connected to God. They want to feel connected to each other. So finding the balance between being culturally relevant and true to your roots, I guess, is something that we need to really find a balance of. But I think what that looks like at the core is that we are being authentic to who we are. So, and I mean that in a global sense and in a local sense. So finding a balance of sticking true to things that we've always done, but also not being afraid to change because there are better ways to do things. So when I came to my first full-time ministry job, it was 2009, I think. The church that I became a part of, where I really took on communication and administration and did a lot of work there. The reason I came in is because the church was experiencing growth, but they were stuck in the past. So they were struggling with administration. They were struggling with how to reach younger families because they historically were such an older congregation. They were struggling with how to communicate well because they were a church still stuck in the 90s, the late 90s, on how to communicate. So in 2010, what does communication look like? And now in 2018 or 2020, what does communication need to look like? What does Sunday service need to look like? How do we stick true to our roots, but also be authentic and true to how culture is changing and how our audience is changing, the congregation is changing? And that means that we need to make some changes sometimes. So don't be afraid of changing things if that means that you're being more effective in reaching the community around you, the next generation. But also don't be afraid of change because you realize something isn't working. So just because you've done something the same way for 5, 10, 50 years doesn't mean that you need to continue doing it that way. So don't be afraid of change, but be authentic to who you are. And so that's why I started out talking about finding the balance there. But that also means that you need to know your audience. So if you are a church that is trying to reach younger generations, you need to know what they're struggling with, what they're dealing with, what their values are. So you need to know who you're trying to reach in order to reach them. In his book, James White talks about 6 different things that his church did to reach this next generation. Most of them I agree with. Some I think depend on the church as a local entity and figuring out how to apply that best. And sometimes that doesn't mean applying it across the board. So the first thing that James White talks about is that he changed the culture of his church so that they realized they were cultural missionaries. He also then skewed his church younger, which means that if you're making decisions or if you're trying to make changes in either the order of service or whatever that may be, a specific ministry, he's going to skew younger in order to reach Gen Z and the people that are growing up there. He also makes time to target men specifically, because men are obviously leaving the church in larger droves than women. And I think for Generation Z, we didn't talk about sexuality today, but that is something that Generation Z is definitely dealing with because culture has changed. So James White made sure that his church targets men as much as they can. They also kind of almost opposite of that, prioritize children's ministry. So they make sure that in everything they do, the children's ministry is a priority for adapting how they do ministry or whatever that looks like, depending on the situation. What I found probably the most interesting out of his 6 basic key points was that he cultivates a culture of invitation. And that is something that is hard to do, but it really is necessary because, as I've talked about and as you can read all over the place, word of mouth marketing or word of mouth outreach is really the most effective means of advertising, of communication, of invitation. So creating a culture that invites people is really something that needs to be cultivated. And so that's something that he strives for in his church, and I think all of our churches need to strive for as well. The last thing that he pointed out was that he disciples the mission. So find your mission. What I talk about a lot of times is viewing everything as discipleship, and I think that really does help you reach the next generation. So one thing that I want you to think about is what ways can your church adapt? So in what ways can your communication adapt? What ways can even your Sunday service adapt to make sure that you are reaching this next generation solidly, that you're making sure that you understand their felt needs, that you understand kind of the culture that they're growing up in, because it's not the same as even what I grew up in or what you grew up in. So what ways can your church adapt? And that's really one of the biggest things that I think we need to focus on, both in communication and in the church, is really realizing, because we know our audience, realizing how we can adapt our message, the way that we're communicating, all of that. So with all of that being said, I'm a little over where I wanted to be, but not too bad. Let me share the handout with you. So you should see that. It is a PDF that you can download with all of the slides that we went through today. So one of the things that I would love to hear from you in the days or weeks or months to come is some of these questions that I've asked that are really more rhetorical, like what ways can your church adapt? I would love to hear how your church is adapting to reach this next generation. But let me answer some questions. We have probably about 15 minutes or so. So what questions do you have? Let me roll through the chat real quick, but if you have a question that you'd love for me to answer or for us to discuss as a group, throw that in the Q&A in that chat column, and I will get to those as we continue here. So what questions do you have about Gen Z, about communicating to Gen Z, or about the church as a whole and what that looks like? Make sure to throw that in that column. To answer your question, Linda, most of the research that I've discussed today is from two sources, one of them being Barna. In January, they produced a study, I believe it's called Who is Gen Z? In fact, I think the website is probably whoisgenz.com. So that is one source. Another source is a book that I read recently called, I didn't bring it in with me, but it's called Meet Generation Z, and it is by an author and pastor, James Emery White. Other than that, at the bottom of every slide, you'll see who I sourced for that statistic or whatever it was. So Anna asked, does the blank slate concept still apply when ministering to youth group kids who have grown up in the church? So the blank slate concept, and if I remember correctly, this is from Barna. They talked about it in their research. It's really a more general sense. So obviously your church youth group has kids who have grown up in church, right? I grew up in church. My wife grew up in church. Our daughter is growing up in church. So that does happen. But across the board, so if 4% of Generation Z has a biblical worldview, that means 96% don't. So 96% of the population, which probably does then trickle down into your community as well, probably somewhat proportionate. Across the board, what that looks like is that they have no biblical worldview, which means the church has a blank slate. So what that means, generally speaking, is that for your youth group, they have a different opportunity than generations before them to go into school, neighborhood, extracurriculars, whatever they're doing, and really see themselves as a missionary, as having a task to do, sharing the Great Commission. And so I think that is something that that as youth group leaders we can invest in our students with. Hope that answers your question. Let's see. So John L. in the chat column said, how do you create a culture of invitation? Great question. I think a lot of times that's easier said than done, but I think it is something that can be done. So one of the things that that helped me do this, so I shared earlier how I started as the communication and administration role in the church that I was in. I moved then into several different roles, but eventually I ended up as the outreach pastor. So what that meant is that I was trying to create a culture of invitation for our multi-site large church. So creating a culture of invitation meant, first of all, that we provided opportunities for people to invite other people. So creating handouts for basically everything we did, and encouraging church members to take those business cards or flyers or whatever it was and use that to invite people. Another way to do that is to create that culture is to, helping church members take ownership. So allowing people to get involved both in the planning, in the execution, in the follow-up of events and of ministries means that they feel more ownership, they get more excited about it, they talk about it more. And so looking for those ways to change the culture in small segments where you start relying on people to do the work of advertising, essentially, rather than relying on the church to bear the burden of having to get the word out and inviting people. So social media is a great way for the church to advertise, right? Even better is when someone actually invites someone that they know. That's kind of the balance that you have to find there. What does it mean to be a cultural missionary? Storm, that is a great question. What that means is that you seek everyday opportunities. So in everyday life, for me, what that looks like, I work at a denomination, a denominational office. I also just moved here. So everyone I know, I either work with or I go to church with. So for me, being a cultural missionary means that I need to be intentional about finding ways to be a missionary in the culture around me. So for me, that looks like going to the gym consistently and at a regular time. Not because I expect myself to get huge or anything like that, but because I want to be a presence and I want to build relationships with the workers or whoever's at the gym at the same time every day. Other opportunities are going to the grocery store for me, or getting my hair cut. I could easily go to someone in the church, have them cut my hair, or even my wife, but I choose to go to a barber because that's an opportunity for me to be a missionary. So being a cultural missionary means that you're seeking opportunities in culture around you to be intentional about the Great Commission, about sharing the gospel there. Jeff, you asked, are there any strategies or suggestions to reduce competition or conflict between the different demographics in church? One thing that I think I come across quite often is really just the realization that churches are making assumptions. So rather than knowing what's actually happening or what people are actually going through or what technology they're actually using, we make assumptions. So a huge one that comes to mind is that we assume that older generations, so let's say baby boomers and older, we assume that they don't have email. So communicationally speaking, what that looks like is we're trying to wrestle with how to communicate clearly to all generations, because in our minds, older people don't have email. And what I realize quite often is that when we sit down and find statistics and we actually find out what's happening is for this email issue is that it's really a much smaller number of people that don't have email than we assume. So rather than making assumptions, one thing that we can do is make sure that we actually know who our audience is and what they are going through, what they use. And so I think that is one huge way that our churches can reduce conflict between generations and demographics. So rather than making assumptions, find out what's actually happening. Some other ways that I think we can do that are really to simplify what we're doing, simplify how we're communicating, simplify what we're doing, and I think that can help alleviate some of the not necessarily the conflict, alleviate some of the burden that's happening intergenerationally. Anna, you also asked, thinking about the large amount of technology used for Gen Z, Do you think leveraging technology to connect with kids at church will be good, or should we be providing technology-free spaces instead, or probably a balance? So I don't remember who mentioned it, but someone mentioned it earlier when I asked how things have changed since 1995. I think someone mentioned about how we have a shorter attention span, and so we get distracted more easily, and that's speaking as adults, right? So for teenagers, for young adults, and for kids who are growing up in this, that's even more so. So small snippets of media can be a good thing, but I think mixing it up, your last phrase, a balance, is probably a very accurate way to do things. So at home, kids have a short attention span, right? But in school, they're still there for 8 hours a day or whatever it is. And teachers don't do everything in short 60-second snippets, right? So I think there is a balance that we need to find of how do we adapt to this changing media, changing technology, changing attention span type culture, and how do we help families kind of alleviate that issue too. So I definitely do think there's a balance that needs to be found. I've mentioned a few times our partner program, Kids Corner. They're wrestling kind of with the same issue. Do we build an app? What do we put in the app? One thing that that we've kind of been playing with is this idea of, I actually don't know if I should be talking about this, but is the idea of creating a daily devotional for kids. And in studying, they found that paragraphs of text is too much. Kids won't read it. So how do you then create a devotional that can't be paragraphs of text that people will still be interactive with and still read and do all of that? So balancing it is definitely going to be a huge issue that I think we need to probably wrestle with for quite a while. But I think wrestling with it and doing nothing are different. So I think it's something we need to wrestle with. Rachel said that they do a daily blog email to all members, but provide 10 copies in the back of the church for older members who won't do email. Simply copying it off makes them feel involved. It's been a win-win for us. Absolutely. And I would bet that not all 10 copies of those are gone after Sunday either. Carl says, sociologists say Gen Z is still too young in development to say too much yet. What do you anticipate as a possible emerging trait not yet fully seen beyond what you've identified? Yeah, so in one of the first slides, I mentioned that Barna's age range for Generation Z is slightly younger. I think it was 99 to 2015. Whereas generally speaking, Generation Z is looked at as 95 to 2010, so they're a little bit older, so generally. But in the Barna research, one of the things that I felt was that kind of the same thing, that they are too young because of the ages that Barna was looking at. It's hard to really realize what's happening because what Barna was surveying, they were teenagers, right? Everybody knows that teenagers, who knows what's happening in their brain. So I think what we are going to continue to see, I think some of the traits of Generation Z will be exemplified as this generation grows up. Technology use, their identity, the achievement idea, I think that will be exemplified. I think some other things will kind of not necessarily grow out, they'll grow out of, but I think will become less important to them. Some of that will be some of the sexuality type things that we didn't talk about, but that you can study kind of on your own. I think there will be some changes there, but I do think there are some elements of this studying that we still don't know. And so that's why I chose today to talk more generally than specific statistics and things like that, because I think for a lot of these studies, they're dealing with 15, 16-year-olds. But what we need to realize is that Generation Z is, depending which age range you look at, they're in their 20s already. They're either freshmen in college or they're graduated college and in the work field already. So, so I don't think this is something that we need to put off, because then 20 years from now we'll be talking about Gen Z when we're 2 or 3 generations down the line. There's also a philosophy, I suppose, that says that Gen Z will really be the last generation because things are changing so rapidly that it's hard to stay on top of the trends and things that are changing. So because technology use, media, all of that has changed so rapidly in the last couple decades, the idea is that that we won't be able to differentiate between generations much longer. Let me scroll through. I saw some of you guys put some messages in the chat. We have just a couple more minutes, but I do want to get to the questions. Vincent, those are some great insights that you added in there. If you guys haven't read them, make sure you check that out. But you did ask, do I think it's important to ensure communications and invitations are not always particularly churchy? So even though the central message is the good news, simply focusing on this with outreach to Gen Z could sometimes be seen as a turnoff for them. Not suggesting at all that we ditch the message, but there are different ways to communicate our invitations. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure what you're getting at, other than design-wise, or messaging perhaps, but I think that we can be culturally relevant and still true to the good news. So what that looks like in your invitations, I think, really depends on your audience. So knowing your audience is important because that helps how you brand your message to them, to use a more business type term. Let's see. Closed Facebook groups are great. All right. So one thing that I do want to make sure to show you guys, since you are here, is our next webinar will be on creating a website for your churches. So right there you can register for that next webinar. It is a month, I believe a month from today. It'll be the 3rd Wednesday in May, same time, 2 o'clock Eastern time in the afternoon. I would love for you guys to be there. This webinar was recorded today, so you should receive a link to that to share with your church staff or whomever if you think that is worthwhile. I would love your feedback. Feel free to shoot me any questions that you have, additional questions. Brian@churchjuice.com. That will come right to me, BRYAN@churchjuice.com, and I would love to answer those. Thank you guys for joining me today. Let me know if I can do anything for you or your church. Have a great day, okay?